Hello, Rune Scholar, wherever and whenever you are. I'm the modern Erilar. If we know names for the runes today, we can thank those who recorded the rune poems. The rune poems are so called because each stanza describes a rune with at least one phrase that contains some kind of poetic convention, like alliteration, assonance, consonance, rhyme, half-rhyme, and so on. The Norwegian and Icelandic rune poems are composed in a skaldic meter called runhent, which contains both alliteration and end rhyme, rather than just the internal rhyme, more common in other meters that appear in Eddic poetry. For each one of the rune poems, the stanza starts either with the rune itself or with the name of the rune, and sometimes both, as you can see here. And then that is followed by a kind of definition that communicates a proverb or a riddle, a kenning, that characterizes the name. These are probably most poetically expressed in the Old English or the Anglo-Saxon rune poem, and there's a more concise set of verses shown here in the Old Norwegian rune poem. For example, the phrase for naud, the rune that makes the N sound, this verse is constraint gives scant choice. Because of the names of the runes and the riddles that preserve them, rune poems have earned a reputation as a record of important cultural information. According to Mathias Nordvig, even in the very abbreviated Danish rune poem, it is easy to see how the runes themselves represent central cosmic elements like cattle, types of weather, sacred trees, celestial objects, cultivated soil. After the definition line, the Norwegian rune poem, and those derived from its tradition, then also include another line that may or may not be thematically connected to the first. The verse for nauder here, constraint gives scant choice, then continues with a B line, an additional phrase, a naked man is chilled by the frost. Aslak Liestøl suggested that some of these B lines describe the shape of the runes themselves, using what Jonna Louise Jensen described as the pictographic principle. To illustrate, the B line for the soul rune reads, I kneel before the holy shrine. And if you rotate the rune 90 degrees, it does very much look like a stylized person kneeling. These B lines very much assume cultural literacy on the part of the reader or the recipient, such as in the stanza for the Writhe rune, this one here, where the B line is, Regin forged the finest sword. We can interpret this line only because we also understand the myth of Sigurd the Dragon Slayer. Regin the smith forged the sword Grammer for Sigurd, and Sigurd immediately proved how sharp it was by slicing Regin's anvil into two pieces. Bernd Neuner suggested that the Writhe rune should be interpreted as a pictogram of half of an anvil, like the type seen here on the Ramsundsberget runestone from Södermanland. We can provide at least a tenuous pictographic interpretation for between 6 and 9 of the 16 runes of the Younger Futhark. So it's not a perfect correspondence, but often our understanding of the culture that corresponded to the language that we call Old Norse may not be precise enough to permit us to generalize out this pictographic principle to all stanzas of the Norwegian rune poem. Because if the story hasn't survived, we may simply not have enough details about Iron Age or medieval Norwegian culture to be able to interpret these kennings correctly. We also lose the rhyme and alliteration of the original language when we translate the rune poems into modern English. These linguistic conventions would have made it easier to remember the sound of the rune, and for the rune poems that follow the pictographic principle, also how to write it. And this makes the risk of confusing one runic character for another pretty minimal, except in the case of extremely similar shapes, like mother and ear, which are a vertical mirror of each other, or and nother, which are a horizontal mirror of each other. So which rune poems survive for us to use as sources today? The Abecedarium Nordmannicum, or the Old Danish rune poem, was composed in the early 9th century. It is the oldest of these surviving rune poem texts and was probably brought by English missionaries to the continent, where it was recorded in a mix of Old Saxon and Old High German languages by a Saxon or Rhineland area cleric, who may have translated it from a Danish original. While, as you can see, the surviving manuscript is in very poor condition, thankfully, Wilhelm Grimm made a copy in 1828, which is much more legible, and having multiple copies helps us to interpret what does the text look like. The Old English rune poem is slightly younger. It's also called the Anglo-Saxon rune poem, and this 9th century or earlier composition survived in a manuscript in the Cotton Library until 1731, when it was destroyed in a fire, and it survives thereafter only because a copy made by Humphrey Wanley was published in a facsimile called Linguarum Veterum Septentrionalium Thesaurus by George Hicks in 1705, but you can call it the thesaurus and that's fine. This text gives the names for the Anglo-Saxon runes, but these seem to appear in the margin, as if they were written in as a gloss later than the original manuscript was itself conceived, and thus they may not be original to the 9th century composition. The Old Norwegian rune poem was probably composed in the 13th century in Norway. The only medieval manuscript that preserved it was a 14th century law book into which the rune poem was probably written down from memory. This manuscript burned in the Great Fire of København in 1728. Similar to the Danish rune poem, we have multiple transcripts that survive, but they do not agree among themselves about the contents of the text, which is a little problematic. And one of these manuscripts, Arne Magneiske Samling Manuscript 738 Quarto, gives 8 extra rune stanzas beyond the 16 of most other versions of the Old Norwegian rune poem. And these ones record stung runes and other medieval developments of the younger Futhark that extended the set to more than just the 16 runes. The Icelandic rune poem developed from the Norwegian version, with 4 versions surviving as of 2025. The language of the text may be as old as the 14th century and is certainly not later than the beginning of the 15th. Each stanza is comprised of 3 kennings that describe the meaning of the rune. The oldest version contains a further explanatory phrase for each stanza comprised of one Latin word that translates the rune name, and then it provides an Icelandic synonym for the word king that starts with the same letter as the rune name does. These multilingual kennings show influences from medieval Icelandic literature and some knowledge of astrology and alchemy that lead scholars to believe they reflect more of an educated elite than the everyday writer. Simpler names appear in the younger versions of the manuscript, and Raymond Page pointed out that these seem to be secondary to the poem. Parts of this manuscript are so deteriorated that they are impossible to read, so some scholars fill in the gaps from the Old English rune poem, and others choose to use Olaf Thordarsson's third grammatical treatise to replace the illegible material. So you will see different versions of the Icelandic rune poem because of those different choices. The Swedish rune poems are the youngest, from the late 16th and 17th centuries. A couple contemporaneous editions survive. One was transmitted in a letter by Swedish student Nicolaus Andreas Granius to the Dutch humanist Bonaventura Vulcanius on the 12th of February 1600, that's now at the University Library in Leiden. As you can see in the illustration, he first gives a list of the names of 18 runes, and then he gives 14 stanzas describing them. Granius said that he obtained the poem A Senibus Rusticus, or From Old Country Folk, and the language does seem to indicate oral transmission of this particular text, but he may have gotten it from Johannes Boreas's Rune Schendlenes Læresbogen of 1599. This is a copper plate with the names of the runes and a kenning description for each in a table on the top right of this very large illustration, and an alternate set of rune graphs given in another table in the center toward the bottom. Boreas also gave the names of the runes in a second, later work specifically on the runic alphabet called Rune ABC. While the old Swedish rune poems could possibly have derived from the older tradition of the Norwegian rune poem, because of the oral transmission that has changed the language that survives in it, Arndkvek considered the poem's language too corrupted to be able to trace a possible lost medieval version. So what we have is a pretty modern version of a rune poem. So why have rune poems at all? What was the purpose? Runologists generally agree that the rune poems were mnemonic devices. These are an aid to recalling the name, and if they contain the pictographic principle, also the way to write the runes, but it would certainly tell you what is the function of this rune, what sound does it make. And at one point, these seem to have been common across several Germanic cultures, whether it's Danish, English, Norwegian, what have you. These probably served as a way for learners to remember the runes, like A is for apple, B is for bear, this kind of imagery that teaches modern English phonics and with which you may be more familiar if that's your first language or how you learned modern Western English. While some rune scholars have suggested that the purpose of the rune poems may also have been to teach the order of the runes within the Futhark, this information appears explicitly within the text only of the Abecedarium Nordmannicum, the Old Danish rune poem. Other rune poems do not include information about which runes are first, which are in the middle, and which ones end it all. So the order of the runes within the Futhark may not have been an explicit purpose for the rune poems. We do know that the kennings for the runes existed outside the rune poems within Old Iron Age, Old Norse culture, because we see them in other contexts. For example, one of the inscriptions from By Church in Telemark contains 6 kennings for runes, many of which also appear in the Icelandic rune poem. And when you put those runes together, they spell the name Gudrun. The kennings in this inscription each differ slightly from the exact phrase given in the Icelandic rune poem, but the writer has explicitly challenged us in the last line to work this out for ourselves. So that added challenge may be part of the puzzle, and we have a lot of evidence that historical rune writers loved a good puzzle. So if you've been puzzling over the rune poems, I hope that this episode has been valuable to you. Thank you for reading the runes with me, the Modern Erilar.